Here is a bizarrely simple question that sounds completely ridiculous until you actually stop to think about it. Why do humans cook? Grizzly bears absolutely never throw their freshly caught salmon onto a backyard barbecue, and bald eagles certainly do not deep fry their daily prey. Literally every other predator on this planet enthusiastically consumes its food completely raw without ever assembling a proper meal. Yet we have been doing this for so long that our very survival is tied directly to the heat of an oven. Total biological dependence. Let us wind the clock back roughly 2 million years to the sweeping, unpredictable landscapes of the African savanna to truly comprehend the crushing reality of a world entirely devoid of fire. Our early hominid ancestors were living in a constant, unforgiving state of biological grind that modern humans cannot even begin to fathom. They were forced to consume a primitive diet that would be virtually unrecognizable as food to us today, consisting primarily of raw leaves, tough protective bark, highly fibrous shoots, and incredibly dense subterranean roots that were violently hard to break down. To understand the sheer physical and temporal toll of this grueling existence, we only need to observe the daily, monotonous schedule of modern chimpanzees living in the wild today. A chimpanzee wakes up with the rising sun and immediately begins the singular, exhausting physical task that will completely consume the vast majority of its waking hours. They forage for a piece of tough raw vegetation, place it in their mouths, and simply begin to chew. They chew and chew and chew, mechanically grinding down the rigid, unyielding cellulose walls of the plant matter for agonizingly long periods just to extract an incredibly meager amount of usable calories. The food is unbelievably dense, extremely bitter, and aggressively resistant to basic digestion. Once one massive mouthful is finally pulverized enough to be safely swallowed, the chimpanzee merely reaches for another tough piece, and the brutal, mindless cycle violently restarts. There is absolutely no real downtime for meaningful socializing, no extended periods for complex cognitive engagement, and virtually no metabolic energy left for anything that does not directly contribute to the immediate caloric intake required to survive until the next sunrise. This suffocating and painfully repetitive daily routine was rigorously quantified in a landmark 2011 scientific study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by evolutionary biologist Chris Organ and his team of researchers. Their exhaustive research revealed a devastating mathematical reality regarding the standard primate raw food diet and its inherent limitations. They calculated that without the external processing power of applied heat, a primate of human size attempting to survive on raw, unprocessed vegetation would literally have to spend anywhere from 6 to 8 solid hours every single day doing absolutely nothing but mechanically chewing. To put the sheer psychological and physical horror of that immense time commitment into a modern perspective, consider the structure of a standard American 9-to-5 workday. Imagine waking up, enduring your morning commute, sitting down at your office desk at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, and doing absolutely nothing but fiercely grinding your jaw against dense, fibrous roots and raw, unyielding tubers until the clock strikes 5 o'clock in the evening. You would not be answering emails. You would not be taking leisurely lunch breaks. You would not be attending meetings, and you would certainly not be brainstorming creative solutions for your future. You would be nothing more than a biological prisoner, trapped in a perpetual, agonizing state of mastication, just to keep your basic internal organs functioning. This immense temporal burden meant that early hominids were essentially handcuffed to their unforgiving food sources with no hope of escape. They were fundamentally incapable of developing sophisticated tools, building advanced societal structures, or migrating across continents because their daily timeline simply did not allow for the luxury of free thought, exploration, or innovation. The entire species was permanently trapped in an uncompromising evolutionary deadlock where any potential for cognitive expansion was severely suppressed by the mechanical limitations of their own jaws. A creature simply cannot conquer the natural world or begin to ponder the vast mysteries of the universe when it is biologically obligated to operate as a full-time, remarkably low-efficiency food grinder. The raw food diet acted as a definitive biological ceiling that actively prevented our distant ancestors from ever becoming anything more than just another species of struggling ape on a highly dangerous continent. This grueling, mastication-heavy existence was the absolute, unquestionable rule of nature for millions of years, dictating the shape, size, and behavioral capacity of every large primate walking the earth. The energy deficit was far too severe, and the temporal cost was simply way too high to ever allow for any meaningful deviation from the relentless daily grind of chewing raw matter. But then a radical, unprecedented technological shift occurred that completely fractured this ancient biological rule and shattered the primate evolutionary ceiling forever. The deliberate application of heat chemically dismantled the tough structural proteins and complex starches before the food ever touched a hominid tongue, suddenly reducing that agonizing 8-hour workday of chewing down to a mere 1 hour of relatively effortless consumption. This staggering liberation of time was the exact critical moment the entire evolutionary trajectory of our species violently pivoted. But wait, here is where the biological story gets genuinely fascinating, because reclaiming those 7 hours of chewing time was only the catalyst for a much darker biological trade-off. Let us rewind the evolutionary clock back approximately 2 million years to fully grasp the crushing physical reality of a world entirely devoid of culinary heat. Our distant hominid ancestors were violently locked into a perpetual state of biological servitude that modern humans cannot even begin to comprehend. They were forced to survive on a primitive, unyielding diet. It consisted almost exclusively of raw leaves, fibrous shoots, thick bark, and incredibly dense subterranean roots. To truly understand the sheer exhaustion of this grueling existence, you only need to observe the daily schedule of a modern wild chimpanzee. A chimpanzee opens its eyes with the morning sun. It immediately begins the singular, agonizing physical task that will completely dominate its waking hours. It grabs a handful of tough, raw vegetation, shoves it into its mouth, and simply begins to chew. It chews and chews and chews. It mechanically grinds down the rigid cellulose walls of the plant matter for painfully extended durations just to extract a pitifully small amount of usable energy. The raw food is aggressively fibrous, incredibly bitter, and stubbornly resistant to basic digestion. Once one massive mouthful is finally pulverized enough to be swallowed safely, the chimpanzee merely reaches for another tough branch. The mindless cycle brutally restarts. There is absolutely no downtime for complex socializing or cognitive engagement. There is virtually zero metabolic energy left over for anything that does not directly contribute to the immediate caloric intake required to survive until nightfall. This suffocating and highly repetitive daily routine was rigorously quantified in a landmark 2011 scientific study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Evolutionary biologist Chris Organ and his dedicated team of researchers revealed a mathematically devastating reality regarding the standard primate raw food diet. They calculated the exact cost of living without the external processing power of applied heat. A primate of human size attempting to survive strictly on raw vegetation faced a grim timeline. It would literally be forced to spend anywhere from 6 to 8 solid hours every single day doing absolutely nothing but mechanically grinding its jaws. To put the sheer psychological and physical horror of that immense time commitment into a recognizable perspective, consider the exact structure of a standard American 9-to-5 workday. Imagine waking up, enduring your morning commute, and sitting down at your office desk at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. You do absolutely nothing but fiercely chew on raw, unyielding tubers until the clock finally strikes 5 in the evening. You would not send a single email. You would not take any leisurely coffee breaks to chat with coworkers. You would certainly not brainstorm creative solutions for your future career trajectory. You would be nothing more than a biological prisoner, trapped in a perpetual state of mastication just to keep your internal organs functioning. Early hominids were essentially handcuffed to their unforgiving food sources. They were fundamentally incapable of developing sophisticated tools or building advanced societal structures because their daily timeline simply did not allow for the profound luxury of free thought. The entire species was permanently trapped in an uncompromising evolutionary deadlock. Any potential for cognitive expansion was severely suppressed by the mechanical limitations of their own teeth. A biological creature simply cannot conquer the natural world or ponder the vast mysteries of the universe when it is strictly obligated to operate as a full-time food grinder. This grueling, mastication-heavy existence was the absolute rule of nature for millions of years. It rigorously dictated the shape, size, and behavioral capacity of every large primate walking the earth. The energy deficit was far too severe, and the temporal cost was simply way too high to ever allow for any meaningful deviation. Heat deliberately applied to food violently changed this grim dynamic. It chemically dismantled the tough structural proteins and complex starches before the calories ever touched a hominid tongue. That external chemical breakdown suddenly and permanently reduced the massive workload. The agonizing 8-hour workday of chewing was instantly slashed down to a mere 1 hour of relatively effortless daily consumption. This unprecedented technological shift liberated an ocean of free time and completely shattered the primate evolutionary ceiling forever. But then something entirely unexpected occurred that fundamentally rewrote the biological rulebook. Listen carefully, because here is the exact part of the evolutionary timeline that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. For decades, the standard narrative of our evolution has been told entirely backward. We casually assume that our ancient ancestors slowly developed massive, highly intelligent brains, and then, using those brilliant new minds, they eventually figured out how to tame wildfire and creatively cook their meals. The causal arrow actually runs in the exact opposite direction. It was not the gradual expansion of the brain that ultimately led to the intellectual mastery of fire. It was not the adoption of bipedal walking that sparked a sudden culinary revolution. It was not the development of complex language that allowed early humans to invent the communal hearth. Cooking came first. Our distant ancestors stumbled into the deliberate heating of their food, and as a direct, irreversible biological consequence of that monumental dietary shift, our brains physically exploded in size. To properly comprehend how completely revolutionary this sequence of events was, you must understand a fundamental economic reality of the mammalian body. In 1995, anthropologists Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler published a groundbreaking scientific framework in the journal Current Anthropology, known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. This hypothesis fundamentally dictates that you cannot simply add a massive, incredibly energy-hungry organ to a living primate without strictly taking that necessary energy away from somewhere else. The human brain is an absolute metabolic monster. Despite making up merely a tiny fraction of your overall body weight, it aggressively consumes roughly 20% of your entire daily energy budget just to keep the neurological lights on. In modern American terms, your brain is the biological equivalent of a massive, aggressively gas-guzzling SUV rolling down the interstate at top speed. It demands a constant, enormous supply of premium fuel, and it will forcefully drain your physiological tank if it is not constantly fed. Our raw food-eating ancestors simply could not afford to park that kind of demanding metabolic vehicle in their evolutionary garage. Their strictly limited daily energy budget was already entirely maxed out by another incredibly expensive internal organ, the digestive tract. Processing tough, highly fibrous vegetation required a massive, sprawling network of intestines, all of which demanded their own massive supply of blood and calories just to function. The early hominid body simply could not afford to run a giant, energy-draining digestive system and a giant, energy-draining brain simultaneously. Something absolutely had to go to balance the biological ledger. Fire miraculously acted as a secondary, external stomach that violently broke down complex starches and tough proteins before the food was ever swallowed. Because the heavy, exhausting lifting of digestion was now being outsourced to the roaring flames of the campfire, the massive internal digestive infrastructure was no longer biologically necessary for survival. The body mercilessly downsized the intestinal tract and immediately reallocated all of that newly freed metabolic energy straight up into the skull. Less gut, more brain. This profound physiological trade-off is not merely a clever biological theory, but a stark physical reality permanently etched into the fossil record. If you look closely at the vast archaeological timeline, a staggering morphological leap occurred approximately 1.8 million years ago with the sudden, dramatic emergence of Homo erectus. According to the foundational 2009 analysis laid out in Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham's landmark book Catching Fire, the skeletal remains recovered from this specific prehistoric era tell a dramatically clear story of a body radically transforming to accommodate cooked food. The fossilized skeletons of Homo erectus abruptly shifted away from their ape-like predecessors in highly specific ways. Their canine teeth suddenly shrank down because they no longer needed to aggressively tear through tough, raw animal flesh and unyielding roots. Their rib cages, which previously flared out widely at the bottom to accommodate a massive, heavy digestive tract, suddenly narrowed significantly into a much sleeker, modern human shape. The vast anatomical space previously required for a giant fermenting colon simply vanished from the fossil record. Simultaneously, their cranial capacity rapidly expanded, leaving them with significantly larger skulls, holding vastly more complex neurological hardware. These sweeping anatomical changes happen together as a direct, packaged biological response to the exact same behavioral catalyst. The physical evidence unmistakably marks the precise moment in deep evolutionary time when the hominid body permanently traded its massive chewing apparatus for a remarkably expensive mind. There is a pervasive, highly romanticized illusion currently sweeping through sun-drenched coastal wellness hubs and incredibly expensive high-end health boutiques. It is driven by a deep, almost spiritual belief that modern humans must urgently return to our absolute most natural, unadulterated state to achieve true health. This rapidly growing movement heavily promotes the strict, uncompromising raw food diet. Enthusiastic practitioners passionately argue that heating vegetation violently destroys essential biological enzymes, aggressively insisting that human biology is perfectly optimized for untouched, unheated earthly bounty. They reject the stove entirely, firmly believing that applied fire artificially corrupts the pure nutritional value of our food. It is a beautiful, highly marketable philosophy that sounds profoundly logical on the surface, right up until you ruthlessly test it against the unforgiving, hardwired reality of human anatomy. Contemporary medical observations of highly disciplined individuals who dedicate themselves entirely to a strict, completely unheated raw food lifestyle without utilizing intensive modern technological supplementation consistently reveal a catastrophic biological failure. These deeply committed individuals simply cannot maintain a healthy body weight over extended periods on a strictly raw diet. They are fundamentally running a severe, steadily worsening metabolic deficit. Because their food is not thermally pre-digested by an external heat source, their incredibly complex, drastically shrunken modern digestive systems are suddenly forced to expend vastly more internal energy attempting to aggressively break down rigid raw cellulose than the actual caloric reward they manage to extract from the plant matter itself. The biological math is brutally unforgiving and completely unsustainable. They are expending considerably more calories processing the food than they are actively absorbing from it. They are literally, quietly starving themselves from the inside out, while relentlessly chewing through massive bowls of pristine raw vegetation. The most striking, utterly terrifying clinical metric emerging from these modern lifestyle experiments heavily involves the female reproductive system. Up to 50% of women adhering strictly to an unheated raw food regime quickly develop a severe medical condition known scientifically as amenorrhea. Amenorrhea is the complete, involuntary cessation of the monthly menstrual cycle. It is not a gentle biological pause, but rather the ultimate, desperate evolutionary emergency alarm ringing throughout the body. When the incredibly demanding human brain rapidly calculates that the daily caloric intake is dangerously insufficient to adequately maintain basic internal organ function, it ruthlessly shuts down fertility before it shuts down anything else. The body violently prioritizes immediate host survival over any potential future reproduction. From a purely evolutionary perspective, any dietary strategy that immediately renders half of your reproductively capable population completely sterile is the absolute most destructive, fitness-destroying lifestyle choice imaginable. It is a rapid, mathematically unavoidable one-way ticket to complete species extinction within a single generation. This extreme modern wellness trend inadvertently serves as a perfectly controlled scientific experiment, brilliantly validating our ancient evolutionary timeline in real time. Here is where this modern clinical data violently collides with 2 million years of deep human history to reveal a chilling reality. You simply cannot choose to successfully eat like a wild primate because you are no longer built like a wild primate. Our bodies were completely, irrevocably re-engineered by the intense heat of the prehistoric campfire. The massive, incredibly heavy fermenting colon required to patiently extract vital nutrients from tough raw foliage is completely gone. The robust, bone-crushing jaw structure built for endless hours of intense mechanical grinding is permanently gone. The expansive, slow-moving internal digestive architecture, capable of actively surviving on cold, unheated roots, is entirely gone. What replaced those primitive anatomical tools is a remarkably sleek, highly efficient biological package that absolutely requires pre-processed, thermally broken down fuel just to keep our massive neurological lights on. We did not merely adopt a highly convenient new culinary habit somewhere out on the ancient African savanna. We entirely burned the biological bridges behind us. ruthlessly shedding vital anatomical infrastructure that we can never, ever organically rebuild. We boldly crossed a definitive, uncompromising evolutionary threshold from which there is absolutely no physiological return. We enthusiastically traded our immense digestive independence for a remarkably powerful, incredibly energy-hungry brain. Consequently, the modern human being is now helplessly locked into a strict, inescapable biological curse. We completely lost the inherent biological capacity to effectively process the natural world without artificially modifying it first. We are undeniably the only living species on this entire planet that will literally starve to death in a lush, highly abundant forest surrounded by untouched natural food if we cannot somehow find a way to spark a flame. Let us pause for a fleeting moment to truly contextualize the sheer, staggering magnitude of what this ancient biological and technological alliance actually produced for the modern world. When our distant hominid ancestors finally satisfied their incredibly demanding caloric needs through the miraculous, deliberate application of heat, they inadvertently unlocked something far more profound than mere physical survival on a hostile continent. They unlocked the evening. With the terrifying, tooth-heavy nocturnal predators of the savanna safely kept at bay by the roaring, protective perimeter of the campfire, a monumental psychological shift occurred. The agonizing biological necessity of endless chewing was permanently eliminated from their daily schedule. Early humans suddenly found themselves in possession of incredibly vast, unprecedented amounts of free time before sleep finally took them. Language organically flourished in the warm, flickering, highly social glow of this protected communal space. Complex storytelling became practically possible for the very first time in planetary history. Intricate social bonds were meticulously forged, carefully negotiated, and fiercely maintained around the shared, steaming output of the evening hearth. The cooking fire was never merely a simple utilitarian tool used for basic caloric extraction. It was the absolute, undeniable genesis of the human household. It was the original anchor point for deep, emotionally complex pair bonding. It served as the very first classroom for transmitting accumulated generational knowledge to highly vulnerable offspring. It became the ultimate evolutionary crucible, where the raw, primal hominid brain finally possessed the luxurious time to actually start thinking comprehensively about the distant future, rather than just frantically surviving the brutal, unforgiving present. Now, consider the breathtaking historical weight of that beautifully shared culinary tradition as it echoes through the ages. The deliberate act of transforming raw nature into a prepared meal is the absolute oldest, most deeply consequential, and singularly most defining technological achievement in the entire sprawling history of our incredibly unlikely species. It is vastly older than the earliest, most primitive attempts at organized agriculture by at least 1,000,000 staggering years. It is exponentially older than the very first scratched symbols of early written language. It is profoundly older than any structured religion, older than the first permanent city, and vastly older than any known human civilization. It is older than the fundamental concept of government itself. It is, quite arguably, even older than the biological capacity for complex spoken language. You carry the permanent, undeniable physical legacy of this ancient African savanna campfire, completely hardwired into the very architecture of your modern human anatomy. The transformative chemical power of the flame permanently shrank your heavy jaw. It drastically shortened your sprawling intestinal tract. It fiercely protected your vulnerable nights. It radically organized your complex social world. Most importantly, it completely liberated the immense biological energy required to actually build, maintain, and sustain the incredibly expensive, high-powered neurological engine that you are using at this exact moment to actively read, process, and completely comprehend these very words. The profound historical gravity of this ancient biological bargain remains entirely unbroken today. Every single time you purposefully step into a kitchen and turn on a burner, you are participating in a deeply sacred evolutionary ritual. When you ignite a backyard grill or stand patiently over a simmering stovetop, you are loudly echoing the distant past. You are actively continuing the exact same technological practice that fundamentally separated your ancient ancestors from the rest of the wild animal kingdom. It is the singular behavioral trait that made you recognizably human in the first place. It is a genuinely breathtaking, awe-inspiring realization to carry with you through the mundane, repetitive routines of your daily existence. It intimately connects your modern, incredibly fast-paced life directly back to those incredibly brave, fire-wielding hominids huddling closely together in the vast, unforgiving prehistoric darkness. This profound biological connection remains absolutely true, no matter the specific culinary circumstances you find yourself in. It remains true even when you are completely exhausted after a tremendously long, chaotic American workday. It remains a beautiful evolutionary truth even when it is 11 o'clock at night and you are standing completely alone in the dim glow of your kitchen, staring tiredly into the rotating yellow light of a humming microwave, desperately waiting to reheat a questionable, slightly crusty bowl of leftover macaroni and cheese. The principle stands.